My task is not easy, basically in 20 minutes to say something about how pandemic influenced life of minorities in Slovakia. And it depends very much on how we will define minorities, what we will include into the group generally described as minorities. And let me stress right at the beginning that I would like to approach my task rather practically. So I will be not bringing a theoretical framework during the conference. We heard already, and we will be hearing very interesting concepts that will try to cover it. So I will suffer, to bring some humor. I will suffer by vulgar empiricism, as I learned as a student in '90s, when you are not really bringing much theory. You are simply suffering by it. Okay, so let me, if I may, let me try to share my screen. Do you see it, all of you? Is it? May I ask Daniel? Is it visible? If it's visible, then let's try to start. I mean, and let me begin by a very simple comment. COVID-19 obviously has had an impact on life of all people in Slovakia. That's absolutely clear. There is hardly anybody who wouldn't have feel that impact. But of course, various groups have been hit very differently. And let me begin by saying that we clearly see it very nicely on employees in Slovakia in general. Those who have well-established short-time work scheme are substantially less likely to be affected by the crisis, obviously. And in Slovakia, in the same way as in many other countries of the European Union, this was a very important part of the game, why our unemployment was not increasing so dramatically as, let's say, in the United States. However, I believe, or I expect that in times when US will be out of the crisis, Slovakia will be still suffering by the consequences of it very much. I mean, impacts are, of course, highly unequal and exacerbate existing inequalities. Workers in alternative work arrangements and in occupation in which only a small share of tasks can be done from home are more likely to have reduced their hours, lost their jobs, and suffered falls in earnings. And this is very much true for Slovakia, equally as for other parts of the world. And since Slovakia have adopted stay-at-home orders, rendering a large segment of the workforce unable to continue doing their jobs, and on purpose, I'm bringing this fantastic caricature from the Czech Republic, which is making fun of stay-at-home orders, which is basically saying we are bringing your latte into your home, which of course is absurd because you cannot do it from home. And these policies have distributional consequences, as workers in some occupations may be better able to continue their work from home, obviously, like me. However, lower wage workers are up to 3 times less likely to be able to work from home than higher wage workers. And this is very much true for most of European Union countries. Those with lower levels of education, younger adults, and minorities, most importantly, are also concentrated in occupations that are less likely to be performed from home. And let me bring you one evidence from the United States, and I'm glad that in the panel I'm with a scholar from United States. Feasibility of working from home by location in the wage distribution, that's the figure 1. You see that those who belong to groups with relatively low wages had very small, that was a relatively small percentage of people who were able to work from home. So during the crisis, either they were losing jobs or they were sentenced, literally sentenced to the jobs with very, very low income. On the figure 3, you already see how race, ethnicity, and of course education have been influencing feasibility of working from home. And honestly speaking, this is very clear, and I will be looking forward to figures of this kind from Slovakia. I believe that especially in case of, let's say, Roma population in Slovakia, which is, we are talking about 8 to 10% of total population, these figures might be even worse, even less flat as we can see it in case of United States. Speaking about minorities, of course, so let me tackle the problems of those who usually we don't consider belonging to minorities. But however, there are various myths. Many people believe that especially pensioners were hit very dramatically by COVID-19 in Slovakia, and I believe that it's not so dramatic. Of course, speaking about the health issues, as we see it on the graph, effect of age on COVID-19 is dramatic. But however, pensions in Slovakia and in many other countries of the European Union are secured by law, and albeit relatively low, pensioners are probably less affected than some of entrepreneurs who basically from one day to another lost their opportunities to run their companies, their jobs, and they lost almost everything. While pensioners with relatively small pensions, which are secured by state, they will have to come probably in slightly better positions than they. So, however, there were decisions of the government that have been perceived as discriminatory against elderly and pensioners in general. And let me explain, those of you who are from Slovakia are perfectly aware of it, but there were hours dedicated for pensioners when they should be actually making their purchases in supermarkets in Slovakia. And they were asked to make their purchases only and exclusively between 9 to 11. During the first phase of the COVID-19 crisis, they were even kicked out of those shops, not allowed to make their purchases. And on top of it, they were very much stigmatized by others. When they appeared outside of these hours, people started to argue with them. So many pensioners felt discriminated against. Of course, this is not a scientific evidence, but I remember how even my mother, who is, of course, over 70, was complaining that people were checking her whether she's pensioner, and basically saying, well, you don't look like a pensioner. And so she had to prove it by showing her ID. So it brought a lot of, as we say it in Slovakia, bad blood. Well, and another myth, which is quite striking, is the myth that COVID-19 had a dramatic impact on life of Christians in Slovakia. And of course, I'm using it's quite funny caricature. As you see, it's kind of a Last Supper on Zoom with the Christ and 12 apostles on Zoom. So it's a Zoom with 13 participants. So of course, this is kind of a parody of the life of Christians during the crisis, when obviously the situation was not very pleasant to any religious group. They were not allowed to participate on holy masses. They were not on services. They were impacted. So the cancellation of the worship services, cancellation of pilgrimages, surrounding observances and festivals. Everything was unpleasant, but at the same time, we cannot speak about really discrimination or the fact that Christians would have been hit dramatically. By the way, in case of Slovakia, churches were opened already in the so-called second phase of opening of Slovak economy and society, much earlier than some other businesses, let's say theaters, cinemas, etc., etc. Some of them are not open until now, while services are going on. So, and finally, I'm approaching issue of minorities as we define them. Various minorities were hit by COVID-19 pandemia more than dominant group of Slovak society. And I will go and try to operationalize something about national minorities, marginalized groups, and especially then, thirdly, LGBTI community, which in my view was hit quite dramatically and visibly. And let me remind you, of course, these are banal information, that minority rights, as applying to ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities and indigenous people, are an integral part of international human rights law. And that was not taken into account by many governments, but I believe this was the story of Slovakia as well, unfortunately. So they are basically designed in order to ensure that this specific group, which is eventually in vulnerable, disadvantaged, or marginalized position in a society, is able to achieve equality, and it's protecting from persecution. Why we are taking care of minority rights? That's pretty obvious, and let me just pick up some of those dimensions that I'm mentioning here to prevent new forms of discrimination. Number 4, that's very important here, because COVID-19 brought exactly what we are talking here about: new forms of discrimination that were not perceived before, and nobody was ready. Nobody was preparing society for those new forms of discrimination. And there are very general guidelines how we should care about minority rights. I will not go through that because Daniel is staring at me already that I'm talking too much. I know. So I will return to these 4 points once I will be speaking about particular groups. So speaking about autochthonous minorities in Slovakia, so-called national minorities as we perceive them, so not migrant minorities, but those who were living on the territory of Slovakia for a long time, and they are recognized as national minorities by state. Vast majority of them were not hit dramatically. Of course, people might bring the case of the most numerous and I would even say most important autochthonous minority in Slovakia, Hungarians, who suddenly were not allowed to travel to neighboring Hungary. In Slovakia, which is part of Schengen Treaty for last 13 years, of course, this was something what Hungarian minority felt as something unpleasant, but again, not discriminatory, because also other inhabitants, other citizens of Slovakia were not able to travel. Otherwise, I don't see really any moments when we can speak about discrimination or some dramatic impact of COVID-19 on autochthonous minorities different than a dominant group. Speaking about homeless people, there is even a paradoxical situation here that COVID-19 brought several positive, unexpected impacts. In bigger cities, such as in Bratislava, institutions started to deal with the issue more systematically than before the crisis. Suddenly we learned that there are 4,000 homeless people in Bratislava, and city authorities started to invest more efforts, more money into the issue. So I would even claim, and although this is slightly problematic claim, of course, because we would have to divide it into small segments, that homeless people were not even hit dramatically by the crisis, and eventually they might even benefit from it. The group which I believe was influenced most during the COVID-19 crisis are Roma people. I believe that they were practically the only clear victims of the government change, because let me repeat that exactly when COVID-19 arrived to Slovakia, Slovakia was after parliamentary elections, government change took place, and all those projects, programs, policies that were prepared by previous governmental plenipotentiary for Roma communities were rejected, were basically thrown out, and it started from the scratch. And as for Roma, I believe that they were discriminated, clearly discriminated, because the aim of quarantine, which was imposed on several communities, Roma communities, especially in Eastern Slovakia, was not to protect minority group, not to protect Roma themselves, but rather to protect majority, or if you want, dominant group from Roma or from Roma settlements. So even the intention was highly problematic. And to prove it, we can discuss it in a discussion. That we have several proofs why we can speak about this bad intention on the side of government, and of course, since Slovakia is a country where Roma are not particularly popular minority. Many people, especially in Eastern Slovakia, were clapping, and they were very satisfied that exactly this is the approach of the government. As for LGBTI people, I believe that exactly as you can see from the slide, LGBTI people face legal challenges not experienced by non-LGBTI residents of Slovakia. I mean, this is banality. The biggest problem was connected with the fact that there is no legal recognition of same-sex marriages, unions in Slovakia. Slovak parliament even in 2014 approved a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriages. And suddenly, during the COVID crisis, since there are various partnership of people of the same sex, either gay or lesbians, who come from various countries, either European Union countries or very often even third countries, the legal position of these people was suddenly basically floating in the air. Some of those people were even deported from Slovakia or asked to leave Slovakia. Some people were not able to reunite their families, precisely because they are not married. Even those who are married outside of Slovakia as a same-sex couples were not recognized as such in Slovakia, so they were not able to reunite, etc., etc. So I believe that both Roma and LGBTI are the best example of it. And let me finalize. I see that Daniel is staring at me. I know that body language. I'm recognizing it already. Let me finalize it by kind of maybe apologizing Slovaks that we ended up in a stage when we are actually speaking about some signs of discrimination of minorities due to COVID-19 crisis. I believe that lack of sensitivity towards needs of minorities during COVID-19 crisis is deeply connected with non-sensitivity about discrimination against various types of minorities in Slovakia in general. Slovaks simply ranks very low among other European countries as far as perception of minority rights, minority needs are concerned. And let me refer to special Eurobarometer 493. Some of my students are well aware of it because I showed it to them. So let me share it with you. These are just few of these figures. In this graph, number one, you see answers of nationals from all European Union countries to the question whether they believe that discrimination against people of other ethnic origin is fairly widespread, fairly rare, or very rare. And in case of Slovakia, you see that Slovakia is basically at the end of this peloton. Only 24% of people believe that it's totally widespread. 62% believe that it's totally rare, which is pretty bizarre, bearing in mind how many groups such as Roma people are in Slovakia, living in Slovakia. And if you compare it with some of Western European countries, Netherlands, France, Belgium, it's almost stunningly different. You know, I mean, generally speaking, we can see how European Union is basically divided into two groups of countries: Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. The next chart is speaking about the same perception based on skin color. As you can see again, so we are talking about, let's say, black people living in Slovakia. There are some, obviously, but Slovaks, in the same way as some other nationals of Croatia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, believe that this is not the case, that there is relatively few discrimination based on skin color. Speaking about Roma, again, Slovakia is scoring relatively very low. Well, of course, there are countries such as Poland, Bulgaria, I'm not mentioning Estonia or Malta, where people are convinced that discrimination doesn't exist. Let me just mention that there are no Roma people in Malta and just 3 families in Estonia. So those figures might be explained by that. But still, countries such as Bulgaria, Poland are scoring equally low. If you compare it with Greece, Sweden, I mean, Greece is a country which is definitely not very open-minded toward Roma, but people are very much aware of discrimination based on the fact that you are Roma. Speaking about sexual orientation, being gay, lesbian, and bisexual, Slovakia is even scoring on the last place. You can see it's stunning that even countries where the status of gay and lesbian LGBTI community is not particularly good, Poland, Hungary, these countries are scoring much better than Slovakia. So Slovaks are, generally speaking, very much convinced that this is not an issue. There is no discrimination against the LGBTI community. Only 25% of people believe so, which is surprisingly low, bearing in mind also the lack of legislation in certain issues. Speaking about ageism, being perceived as too old or too young, but in this case, it's probably much more the case of old. Again, Slovakia is scoring very low among Germany and Luxembourg, but those are countries where these issues are handled, I believe, properly. So again, there is lack of sensitivity toward these issues. Even if there is a discrimination against elderly or young people, people in Slovakia don't see that. Disability, again, Slovakia at the end, you know, completely different to countries such as France, UK, or Belgium on the other side of the chart. So to conclude, I believe that if there was a problem with consequences, negative consequences of COVID-19 crisis on various minorities in Slovakia, it is very much connected with the lack of sensitivity toward minority issues, toward eventual discrimination of minorities in Slovakia. And in order to prevent that it might eventually repeat itself in the future, there is a simple solution. We must increase our sensitivity about possible discrimination of various groups of people in Slovakia. Thank you so much.